I'm curious as to, I mean, because I imagine that you spend a lot of time engaged in this conversation with other Jews who are who have issue with your perspective on these. Certainly, this conversation is in my personal life and in I think maybe all of ours, but certainly around family members. I have been pointing to the fact that one of the fundamental, building blocks of Zionism was that argument that fundamentally Jews cannot be safe without the existence of an Israel, and that Israel was founded at least largely in part as a safe haven for Jews. Yet here we are, 75 years out from the Holocaust. And my Jewish education consisted of Holocaust, Israel, then maybe Hebrew and Jewish culture in that order. And, I was 30 years out from the, I'm in first grade and 30 years out from the Holocaust. I mean, that was the order of things at that time. But 75 years out from the Holocaust, we have the greatest attack on Jews since then. It seems to me like this question of fundamentally, has this version of Zionism, assuming that there were other versions that maybe Buber or Hannah Arendt had promoted, but this version, this road taken, whenever that road was taken in the context of Israel, has failed in one of its fundamental primary objectives. And I've had conversations with people in Israel like, we're much safer in Israel than you are in America. I hear these things about what's happening in colleges, and we go to the bomb shelter 4 times a day, but it's just like a course of things. And I'm like, do you not hear what you're saying?
Right. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's funny. I remember having this conversation with a Palestinian guy I know in Atlanta, and he was telling me how he would watch these Orthodox Jews in Atlanta walking to shul walking to synagogue on Shabbat, and he said, if they had been where my family is in the West Bank, they would have been armed, or they would have had people with arms around them, right? And so, yes, I think, look, at the most fundamental level, I think that if you hold millions of people without basic rights, you are inflicting tremendous amount of violence upon them, right? Now, often that violence goes unnoticed because it becomes it's so structural, it's so obvious that in some ways people kind of ignore it if they're not suffering it. But these are systems of tremendous violence. And when you impose tremendous violence on people, you are also going to bring violence upon yourself. That doesn't mean I justify Palestinian acts of violence against Israeli civilians, not at all. But that's what happens. That's why the IRA was blowing up department stores in London. It's why the ANC created a military wing in 1961. Nelson Mandela was not a believer in nonviolence. He was a believer in armed resistance, right? And white South Africans believed overwhelmingly that if they gave up their supremacist state, then black people would just kill them because they'd be defenseless, right? Instead, what happened was that Mkhonto we Sizwe, the military, the wing of the ANC, had no reason to exist anymore because black people had the vote, right? Because most people, the vast majority of people, would like the government to be able to advocate for their rights peacefully through a political system in which they have representation. And that's also why the IRA stopped blowing up things in London. Now, people think that I'm insane and unbelievably dangerously naive when I say that I believe that process could happen in Israel-Palestine too. But you know who I find does not tend to think that I'm naive when I say this? Palestinians, right? I have almost yet to hear a Palestinian say that they think this is absurd and naive. I hear in my Jewish community from Israeli Jews and American Jews constantly that basically this is not the way the Middle East works. I don't understand Palestinians. I don't, all this stuff. I think that actually political science research shows that in deeply divided societies, those societies are more peaceful when everyone has a voice in government. And what would have happened if America had never given black people the vote in the 1960s? What would have been the trajectory of violence that we would have seen in the United States? I think we can imagine what would have happened, right? That's in some ways what Martin Luther King was saying to America. He was saying, if you don't give us the vote, so that we have the ability to advocate as still profoundly flawed as it is, things would have been a hell of a lot more dangerous for white Americans if that not had happened. And I think that's how I see Israel-Palestine as well.
I can't help but think, and I've had the similar experience. The idea that there would be Jews surrounded by Muslims, all the Jews will be dead, right, to be a sort of a learned condition of racism.
Yes.
I mean, and that the irony is that in the attempting to pursue the Abraham Accords, mm-hmm. Which I think in many respects created the urgency for Hamas in some respects. I mean, I don't know the internal workings, but it seems logical that it would have created an urgency that, like, you're not going to put us on this reservation and we're not going to be part of this. But the same people who promote the Abrams Accord must acknowledge that those accords are made with Muslims. So, like, the idea that there's something essential about the Jewish-Muslim dynamic that is impossible is absurd. We've seen, I mean, and aside from the fact that, like, prior to 1948 or 47 or the late 40s, you had Jews living amongst Arab countries, with more or less of the same problems that they had in Christian ones.
Avi Shlaim wrote about this, right, in his books, as his experiences as an Arab Jew.
Growing up in Iraq. Yeah. Yes. I mean, again, not to say that those situations were always simple or easy or Jews had full equality, but actually they were better than in Christian countries. I mean, I think the reason people like the Abraham Accords is they are a way of Israel getting legitimacy, right, without Israel having to deal with denying Palestinians basic rights. And so there was this idea that you could kind of just ignore the Palestinians. So they were just another group of Arabs and not even a very important one, right? And so you could go to the really important Arabs and Muslims and you have a good relationship with them. I think that, fundamentally, I think your point about racism, Sam, is really, really right. There's a very, very deep racism which is so embedded in the discourse in Israel, among Israeli Jews, and also among diaspora Jews like us, that it's almost unconscious. And, like, one way to recognize that is that we don't even have a term really for anti-Palestinian bigotry, right? We might talk about Islamophobia, but we talk about anti-Semitism all the time. Imagine if we were to say that people who were anti-Palestinian bigots shouldn't have a legitimate role in our public discourse. Then barely anyone in Congress would be allowed, because they're all anti-Palestinian bigots. They all are totally fine, if not downright ecstatic, about the fact that millions of Palestinians have fewer political rights than a black person in Mississippi in 1953, because they're not even citizens of the country in which they live, the government that controls their lives. And so it's so accepted that people don't even, I think it's just the water in which we swim.
Is Zionism inherently a racist ideology?
So I believe that there were alternative strands of Zionism, of non-statist Zionism, cultural Zionism, which I find attractive, which basically imagined the importance of a Jewish culture in historic Palestine, the revival of Hebrew as a living language. Even halakhically under Jewish law, there are certain commandments that can only be done in what's called Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. So people like, as Sam was saying, people like Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, at various points, Hannah Arendt, even Albert Einstein. But those people did not support a Jewish supremacist state. They supported an equal binational state. And so that kind of Zionism, that road not traveled, I think there are important lessons in it. The reason I think it's important to remember that tradition is it offers us a model of equality in which Jews don't leave. Jews stay and flourish. And not just and flourish as equal people, and also people who can have a Jewish culture, right? And that's really important. But political Zionism has always been devoted to the idea that this should be a state that serves Jews, and that in order to create such a state, you either have to kick the Palestinians out or you have to hold them down. And that, unfortunately, and even though I recognize that state has been a godsend for some people, right? I mean, the fact that there were for those Jews who were in displaced persons camps after the World War II, they weren't allowed into the United States. The United States didn't even allow Jews into the United States after the Holocaust, right? And which is one of the reasons Truman wanted a Jewish state, actually, was because he knew he wanted to get the Jews in Germany out of the DP camps, and he wouldn't let them into the United States. I understand, and there have been people in my family for whom that was was an experience of liberation and refuge. I recognize that. But for Palestinians, it has been an experience of dispossession and racism. There's just no question about it.
People should also note that when we hear arguments as to there's plenty of Muslim countries that the Palestinians could go to, that when the question of Caucasian Jews going to America or moving to other countries at that time, that was out of the question. It was equally, it was absurd to people even in the wake of the Holocaust. Let me ask you this, and I know we've held you a little bit long, and I appreciate you're doing this, but the tenor of the Israeli sort of like body politic and just sort of the population. I mean, 20 years ago, there was, I think, like, at least when I was critical of Israel, we would talk to people on the Israeli left, and there was a sense that maybe things could go in a different direction.
Yeah.
In the wake of massive immigration from Russia in particular, and almost like a direct pipeline between there and, maybe stopping off in Brooklyn in some instances, going right to the West Bank. What is your perspective on how the Israeli psyche has changed? Because, we have open, it seems to me, fascists in the Israeli government. I mean, non-controversial. Right. There's controversy as to what the word fascism means, and we talk about it here in America. Is Donald Trump a fascist and this and that? There are fascists in the Israeli government who I think, like, there's nobody who could argue that they're not. I mean, in some instances, they're self-proclaimed. What do you make of that? Like the nature of the Israeli population that supports such a thing?
I think part of the problem is that because we have so kind of ingrained the notion of Israel as an ethno-state, that very frequently when people use the term Israeli to talk about Israeli citizens, right, they use it as synonymous with Jewish Israeli citizens, right? And this is really relevant to the question of the Israeli left. So when people talk about the Israeli left, what they mean is Israeli Jews who supported a Palestinian state, maybe are opposed to settlements, right? But 20% of Israel's citizens, right? I'm talking about in Israel proper, not the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. Israel's citizens are Palestinians, right? They get called Arab Israelis because that was a way of kind of imagining that they weren't really Palestinians. But they're just the Palestinians who managed to not get expelled in 1948, right? That's a larger percentage of the population than Black people are in the United States, right? So if you are thinking about what it means to have an Israeli left, they are at the core of that Israeli left because they're the people who are seeking equality, right? People who are who are on the bottom, who get discriminated against, tend to be the backbone of the left, right? So when you want to talk about reviving an Israeli left, you start there. Right. Otherwise, it's imagining like the Democratic Party is going to win without Black people. The problem is because ethno-nationalism and Jewish supremacy is so deeply embedded in Israeli politics, they've always been considered essentially, even though they can vote and have their political parties, not legitimate partners for government. If you want a really legitimate Israeli left, I think you need a genuinely Jewish and Palestinian political party based on the principle of equality. And it won't win elections, but it would have a real base of support. And the strongest base of support would be among Palestinian citizens. I guess,
let me rephrase that, because I think, and there was certainly a question, I guess, 8-9 months ago, whether the larger protests about the sort of the authoritarianism that was being, like in the domestic authoritarianism was people were going to realize, like, oh, wait a second, we can make common cause here and sort of tie together the Jewish left to the extent, or even the Jewish, center and the Israeli left. But I guess what I'm talking about is the nature of the right in Israel has moved. I mean, it's happened in this country too, but the pace and the I think, like, person for person, it feels like the right has become a different thing in Israel. And maybe it's it's become larger part of the Israeli population, and the how sort of like, I don't know, I mean, fascistic and authoritarian some of that right has become, I think it's striking. And I wonder how much of that, do you perceive that as a function of like, bringing in immigrants and putting them, these are people coming out of the Soviet Union as well, which was a very different type of system, and being and given their freedom, but under certain terms that I wonder what your perspective is on that.
I think it's complicated because when we say right in Israel, we really mean three different things. One of which is religion, right? A second is a view on economics, right? Socialist versus capitalist. And the third is treatment of the Palestinians. So Israel has become a more religious society. The percentage of people who are religious, ultra modern Orthodox has grown, and you see that in this government, which is the most religious government. So that's part, and so that has views of women, LGBT. So that's one thing that means people. It's also true that Israel used to be a much more socialist country and has become a much more neoliberal country, and Benjamin Netanyahu was central in that. So that's another way. And so when people talk about going to the right, they conflate it also with the question of treatment of the Palestinians. And here I think it's not as simple as saying that this government is much more right-wing, because remember, Palestinian citizens of Israel were held under military law from Israel's creation until 1966. This was under socialist, secular, labor governments, right? The greatest expulsion of Palestinians was under the Labor Party at its founding, and then another big expulsion in 1967. Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, they're pikers compared to that in terms of the number of Palestinians they've expelled, right? So I think the challenge is you are right that there are real fascistic currents, but I think it's also important for us to remember that this is in some ways in Israel's political DNA, and it's not necessarily that these folks are doing things that are so different than when it comes to their treatment of the Palestinians than previous Israeli governments that had a different cultural vibe to them.
And I would imagine also just things like social media and phone cameras make it also feel maybe a little bit different than it would have.